Let me now introduce our second speaker this morning, Professor John Hedley Brooke, who is an old friend and colleague of mine from our joint days at the University of Lancaster in the 70s and 80s, was from 1999 until his retirement in 2006, the first holder of the Andreas Idrios Chair of Science and Religion at Oxford. Educated here at Cambridge, he has, since his retirement, renewed his connection with Lancaster University as an honorary professor of the history of science, and also with Durham now as a distinguished fellow at their Institute of Advanced Study. An unfailingly modest, gracious, and meticulous scholar, Professor Brooke has long specialized on the history of science and religion debates in Victorian England, especially on the varieties of responses to Darwin. His recent books include Science and Religion, Some Historical Perspectives, 1991, and his Gifford Lectures with Geoffrey Cantor, Reconstructing Nature, The Engagement of Science and Religion, 1998. He will speak to us now on Darwinism and the survival of religion. Professor Brooke.
Good morning, and may I also thank the organisers for the very great privilege of speaking to you this morning. Dan, of course, is a hugely difficult act to follow. I tried growing a beard in 25 minutes. Outside the old city of Jerusalem, beneath the Mount of Olives, you find the Church of the Agony. It commemorates the anguish of Jesus Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. On the precinct wall, there's a sign. It reads, "No explanations in the church." Much could be read into those cryptic words. The notice is, of course, an instruction to tour guides not to spoil the silence of what for Christians is a sacred place. For those skeptical of religious claims, something rather different might be read into the message, that religious explanations have nothing to offer that can compare with the rigor of scientific ones. But then again, those same words, no explanations in the church, could symbolize something altogether different, that religions provide not explanations, but interpretations of the human condition and of the nature of human responsibility. And that distinction between explanation and interpretation will run through this talk. Essentialist definitions of religion, as one critic has observed, are like books on dieting or stock market predictions. There are a lot of them about, and they don't seem to do much good. I shall speak informally as a historian of science who has studied the responses of religious thinkers to Darwin's brilliant synthesis. But to understand these responses and the survival of religion in the modern world, we do, I think, have to acknowledge a complexity to which Darwin himself was sensitive. In his Descent of Man, Darwin had this to say about religious devotion. The feeling of religious devotion is a highly complex one, consisting of love, complete submission to an exalted and mysterious superior, a strong sense of dependence, fear, reverence, gratitude, hope for the future, and perhaps other elements. In other words, religion is not just about whether a God exists or not. As the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein insisted, being religious is more about passionate commitment to a reference system for interpreting the world. Interpreting, not necessarily explaining. That passionate commitment, as we know from the testimony of religious believers, can be a transforming, life-enhancing experience. It can provide solace in a suffering world and support from fellow travelers. It can reinforce moral resolve, as Darwin recognized when discussing the evolution of the moral sense. No doubt, it leads and can lead to forms of tyranny and enslavement. But a religious commitment may also confer a strong sense of personal identity and value. It can meet an existential need for acceptance. The mistake would be to identify religious phenomena with just one or too few of these features. For example, many have tried to explain religion away as merely a comforting opiate. But this would miss the respect in which the religious life can be deeply uncomfortable in the demands it may make. In their missions to transform, many of the world's religions require self-sacrifice, self-renunciation, self-dispossession. Their adoption can be painful as well as palliative. So, when we look at the religious responses to Darwin, we're not simply dealing with a clash between inferior and superior science. As one recent commentator has put it, to see religion as a botched attempt to explain the world is like seeing ballet as a failed attempt to run for the bus. Religious commitment can be a complex phenomenon, often consolidated by the embrace of distinctive social and political aims. We should not expect a simple story about the corrosive effects of Darwinian science. Even within the same religious tradition, responses to Darwinism have been remarkably diverse. One reason for that diversity is that Darwin's science soon provided a resource for attacks on institutionalized religion. This was true in France during the Third Republic. It was true in Germany, where Ernst Haeckel promoted a form of Darwinism that was both popular and secular. And it was true here, where Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley, battled against the privileges of the Anglican establishment. The transformation of a scientific theory into a secular ideology was also visible in Britain in 1874, when the physicist John Tyndall delivered his presidential address to the British Association. Whereas Darwin had used religious language when referring to the ultimate origin of life, Tyndall reproached him for his vacillation. In the creed of scientific naturalism, there must be no room for miracles. These Darwinist attacks on religion followed a predictable pattern. If an intervening deity was no longer required to account for the origin of species, it was not required at all. And against specific Christian doctrines, such as the fallen state of humanity, there was now an inviting riposte that man had risen, not fallen. For Darwin's disciple, George Romanes, the crux was not whether belief in evolution and belief in creation were compatible. In principle, they were. The deeper issue was whether Darwin's mechanism of natural selection was consistent with belief in a God with the noblest of attributes. The move from Darwinism to a militant atheism was not made by Darwin, but it has been a persistent one, typified by Richard Dawkins' much-quoted remark that Darwin first made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Paradoxically, though, if we're trying to understand the survival of religion as a phenomenon, aggressive attacks from whichever side are apt to elicit determined counterattacks, with the consequence that the most conservative forms of religion are likely to be reinforced through their oppositional stance. This may be one reason why Darwin himself desisted from mounting an offensive, despite his rejection of Christianity. Darwin did insist on a distinction between agnosticism and atheism, and his reasons may help us to understand how it was possible for religious thinkers to accommodate his scientific program. Darwin did destroy William Paley's argument from contrivance in nature to a transcendent contriver. This is just a little collage of those examples of engineering on which Paley himself drew. But it's less clear that Darwin destroyed all of Paley's system, in which the laws of nature derived from a transcendent lawgiver, and in which nature was unified. In his large book on natural selection, of which The Origin of Species was a summary, Darwin explained what he meant by nature. By nature, I mean the laws ordained by God to govern the universe. Even during his later agnostic phase, he declared it would be absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. In a similar way, it was possible for religious apologists to build on that platform of natural laws rather than on gaps in scientific knowledge. One who did so as early as 1860 was Frederick Temple, a future Archbishop of Canterbury. The bad habit of invoking a god of the gaps to explain what science supposedly cannot explain is still with us today. But in judgment over it, there should be the notice, no such explanations in the church. Another distinction is also important. This is between responses from the constituency of popular religion and responses from a more highly educated intelligentsia. This distinction was already important in Darwin's day. In 1871, the year in which The Descent of Man appeared, a liberal Unitarian minister, Francis Ellingwood Abbott, wrote the following note to Darwin. If I rightly understand your great theory of the origin of species, it contains nothing inconsistent with the most deep and tender religious feeling. It certainly conflicts with the popular notion of God, but it seems to me harmonized thoroughly with the enlightened ideas concerning him held by all highly cultured minds of today. And for one, I feel you've done a vast service to true religion by your labors. Now, this motif of a possible service to religion appeared regularly among Victorian intellectuals. In the 19th century, at least, the devil didn't have all the best sound bites. One of Darwin's earliest converts, the Reverend Charles Kingsley, spoke in his novels of the greater admiration due to a creator who could make things make themselves. The Oxford theologian Aubrey Moore spoke of Darwin as having, under the guise of a foe, done the work of a friend. And what he meant was the emancipation of Christianity from infantile images of a deity who, like a conjurer, had magicked new creatures into existence in separate acts of intervention. Darwin was to be given the credit for having corrected a semi-deistic travesty of the faith. In the rest of this talk, I want to survey very briefly just a few thinkers who provide further clues about the survival of religion in a Darwinian universe. It has, of course, been argued many times that there need be no conflict once science and religion are accorded their separate spheres of authority. Controversially, the late Stephen Jay Gould became an advocate of that position in his well-known book, Rocks of Ages. My sample, however, is of four earlier thinkers spanning the 19th and 20th centuries. All were scientists, all were Darwinians in their way, Each illustrates a different reason why Darwinian science has not defeated a religious sensibility. Each in its way shows how religions are not fixed species, but may survive through adaptation. Darwin, after all, saw religions as evolving cultural products. My first example is the Harvard scientist Asa Gray. A devout Presbyterian, Gray did more to promote Darwin's concept of natural selection in North America than anyone. Gray was deeply impressed by the quality of Darwin's science, unlike, one has to say, his Harvard colleague Louis Agassiz, who judged it poor, very poor. But there were other reasons why Gray was attracted to Darwinian evolution. For one thing, it underlined the unity of the human species, since all races shared a common ancestor. For Gray, and as we've recently learnt perhaps more clearly than before, for Gray, as for Darwin himself, this was an intellectual resource in condemning slavery. Gray also argued that Darwin's theory helped to make sense of so much pain and suffering in the world. That had long been a pressing problem for theology. But Gray suggested it could be less so if the struggle for survival was a precondition of the very possibility of evolutionary change, the very possibility of the eventual emergence of human beings. Interestingly, a not dissimilar argument has recently been advanced by the evolutionary biologist Francisco Ayala in his book Darwin's Gift to Science and Religion. Gray lost Darwin when he proposed that God might be loading the variations on which natural selection worked. But with that modification, Gray kept his Christian beliefs intact. This reminds me, actually, there's a wonderful play about the exchange of correspondence between Darwin and Asa Gray. It's being performed later this week in the ADC Theatre. And if you haven't yet got a ticket, get one. It's worth dying for. My second example may be surprising, but it's none other, certainly not him. My second example may be surprising, but it's none other than Thomas Huxley. For all his critique of ancient cosmologies, for all his animus against theology, for all his anti-clericalism, Huxley still left room for a more private religion. It was a religion of feelings and moral example in which, as the prophet Micah had put it, one walked humbly with one's God. In this deconstructed form, there need be no conflict between science and religion. In fact, Huxley had strong words for those who pretended that there was. The antagonism between science and religion, about which we hear so much, appears to me to be purely factitious, fabricated, on the one hand, by short-sighted religious people who confound a certain branch of science, theology, with religion, and on the other by equally short-sighted scientific people who forget that science takes for its province only that which is susceptible of clear intellectual comprehension. Huxley's stance reminds us, of course, that how we define science and how we define religion do determine how the relations between them are understood. My third figure also distinguished clearly between institutionalized religion and more individual forms of religious experience. William James was more psychologist than evolutionary biologist, but he'd been deeply affected by Darwin's science. In his famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, James referred to a new temper of the scientific imagination, symbolized by Darwinism. From his research, James concluded that the essence of religion did not consist in theological reasoning, but in the promise of richer and more satisfying lives. Those for whom the promise became real had the assurance that an unseen force was aligned on their side when fighting moral battles. James even suggested that beliefs that were luminous, reasonable, and morally uplifting could, in a sense, be verified if they had edifying consequences for one's life. This meant for James that the juxtaposition of science and religion was not a crude antithesis between verified science and blind faith. And there were also practical consequences of his analysis, which for some can be consoling, for others, terrifying. James wrote, "Every sort of energy and endurance, of courage and capacity for handling life's evils, is set free in those who have religious faith. For this reason, the strenuous type of character will, on the battlefield of human history, always outwear the easygoing type, and religion will drive irreligion to the wall." 'Tis terrifying. In a Darwinian universe, it was the religious who were best fitted to survive. My last example is one of the most distinguished evolutionary biologists of the 20th century, Theodosius Dobzhansky. Admired for his contribution to population genetics, Dobzhansky, in common with other prominent geneticists such as Ronald Fisher, saw an overarching progress in the pattern of evolutionary development. One of his aphorisms probably wins the prize for the most quoted scientific motto on the web, and we've already heard it several times this week. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. But it's perhaps less well known that he belonged to the Eastern Orthodox Church and so saw no threat to his faith from his science. Whether or not there were ulterior purposes in the universe was a question that science could not be expected to answer. Here's a brief passage from his book, Mankind Evolving, and I quote it because it illustrates yet another way in which religious belief and evolutionary biology could coexist, this time through the reinterpretation of religious doctrine in the light of science. Dobzhansky is integrating his orthodox theology with an evolutionary account of human self-consciousness. The meaning of the acquisition of self-awareness in human evolution is expressed beautifully in the biblical symbol of the fall of man. Self-awareness is a blessing and a curse. Through self-awareness, man attained the status of a person in the existential sense. He became conscious of himself and of his environment. Self-awareness and foresight brought, however, the awesome gifts of freedom and responsibility. Man knows that he's accountable for his acts. He's acquired the knowledge of good and evil. This is a dreadfully heavy load to carry. No other animal has to withstand anything like it. There is a tragic discord in the soul of man. This talk could have been about a different discord, the various contexts in which scientists and religious thinkers have placed Darwinism and traditional forms of religion in opposition. And I certainly don't wish to be misunderstood, because I do not intend to minimize the well-known problems. But I have been suggesting a few reasons why prophetic reports of the death of religion can be exaggerated. There is another Darwinian imprint with which I would like to conclude. This is Darwin's inspiration for naturalistic accounts of the origins of religion. One among many current models puts the spotlight on agency detection systems and the role of natural selection in favoring hypersensitivity to the signals of predators and prey. Might this help to explain why in early human history it would have been natural to see invisible spirits and gods behind inexplicable phenomena? I think Darwin would have given his imprimatur to this particular model. In his Descent of Man, he comments on the behavior of his dog. Dan showed us a wonderful little cartoon with the dog who was thinking only of a bone. Darwin's dog was much brighter. One summer day, it suddenly barked at a parasol swaying in the breeze. Darwin surmised he must have reasoned to himself that movement without any apparent cause indicated the presence of some strange living agent, and that no stranger had a right to his territory. For Darwin, there was an obvious connection with early animism among humans. I was tempted to say that his proto-religious dog began to illuminate a whole train of theological dogmatic, but then thought better of it. The big question is whether such naturalistic models necessarily tell us anything about the epistemic status of highly developed religious systems. If the capacity for religious belief can be explained biologically, and particular forms of the religious life historically, is this tantamount to explaining it away? After all, there's nothing more subversive than to be told why one believes what one believes one believes. And yet, the shift from a naturalistic account of religion to a naturalist critique of religion is not necessarily straightforward. One reason is that the sharp distinction between nature and supernature, on which the critique usually rests, already assumes a secularization of theistic philosophies of nature. For many religious believers, at least in times past, nature and supernature were not antithetical terms. It was often a case not of either or, but of both and. Darwin himself was well aware that his view of nature still left room for theological interpretation. As he conceded to Asa Gray in May 1860, I can see no reason why a man or other animal may not have been aboriginally produced by laws, and that all these laws may have been expressly designed by an omniscient creator who foresaw every future event and consequence. But then, with the honesty and humility that make Darwin so endearing, there is the characteristic nuance. The more I think about it, the more bewildered I become. Thank you very much.